Hello again everyone and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John and as always, thank you so much for being here. A good topic for you today. Let's do it. What's the scariest experience you've ever had on a flight before? Please remember to like, share, hype, stay tuned for shoutouts, and subscribe. Once the cabin lights went out and the plane dropped suddenly during turbulence, everyone gasped at the same time. That collective silence was scarier than the drop. I was on the company jet, a Hawker, when we heard a large bang toward the rear of the plane. On the plane was the company's president, his executive admin, chief financial officer, and me. We just looked at each other after we got caught our breath. We heard the left engine rev up, and the pilots told us we're going to the nearest airport for an emergency landing. When we deplaned, we saw that we were missing the right engine. They found it in a cornfield a few days later. Long flight during the day and a loud pop occurs, after which the cabin starts to look like we're in the middle of a cloud. O2 masks deploy and temp drops noticeably. Plane immediately starts steadily dropping altitude via the pilot, who comes on and says a door seal failed. Landed halfway through our flight at a random Midwest airport, switched planes and went on our way. I doubt anyone on the plane ever forgot that ride. I had major bubble guts and went to the bathroom. The second I sat down, we hit major turbulence. It was so bad that I was actually looking around for a seatbelt on either side of the toilet. During this time, someone started banging on the bathroom door. We didn't lose an engine or anything, but that was actually my personal hell. Sitting front row on the aisle, face to face with the lead flight attendant in the galley jump seat in bad storm turbulence lightning, and heard a loud whack and quick altitude drop. We locked eyes and the look on her face was off. Later, in clear air, we shared a quiet fist pump. I was flying from LA to Atlanta and sitting next to this lady and we're talking. She told me she was married to a pilot many years ago. About 30 minutes from landing, the pilot came on the speaker. He said they were not sure if the wing lights were working properly, so he was sending the co-pilot to check it out. The lady looks at me and says a flight attendant could do that. Why is the co-pilot coming? We start to descend, and it seems like we're going very fast. As we come in, ambulances and fire trucks are coming to us. We hit hard and took a long time to stop. We end up at the end of the runway. We found out later the wing flaps were not working, but no one was hurt, and we finally got to the terminal. I used to fly a lot. Jumped an alternate flight from Cleveland to Chicago feeling like a rock star. Then the cabin started to fill with smoke and we made an emergency landing in Indianapolis. Chicago to Boston, lost a wheel on takeoff. Emergency landing in Boston. Brace, brace, brace is a real thing. Very large drop mid-flight near Denver. Always keep your seatbelt fastened. Always. A lot of people were injured, a few seriously from hitting their heads when they flew up and hit. I've been on 2 flights that people died during the flight. I assume heart attacks. Both were emergency landings. Flying from Narita, Japan to Australia, we had to make an unexpected landing in Fiji because we were low on gas. The pilot got on the intercom, told us what was up, and then asked if anyone had a credit card that worked in Fiji. We all laughed. I flew from Santiago to Auckland in August. The weather was getting pretty wild in Chile when we left. We took off and it was all calm for the first 45 minutes or so. Around an hour and all hell broke loose. The plane started jumping up and down and smashing side to side. It was pitch black outside, so you had no reference as well. The steward team looking terrified and locked the plane down. Nobody could move for 4 hours as we flew through what felt like a hurricane for hours. They couldn't even walk straight, let alone commence bar service. I've flown long hauls so many times, but this was the one flight that I was terrified on. I think being over the Pacific and knowing that there was nowhere to land if it got too bad made it worse. I watched the crew and see how nervous they are. They're normally very calming, seeing them laugh and joke, etc. This time though, they were all shitting themselves, which made it so much worse. Bonus points for Miami to London, and we hit a massive storm. Again, everybody was told to just stay still and not move for hours. I had 2 bottles of whiskey, so I got them down and my seatmate and I just started passing the bottle. Others caught on, so we ended up having a whiskey bottle pass session with my new friends in rows around us. That was actually great fun. I've been on some rough ones between the military and flying privately, but you guys aren't here for that, right? We get some shoutouts. All right, so based on what I saw yesterday, first of all, great feedback and looking forward to doing more. But right now I want to thank Noelia, Plum Bob, that's the handle you prefer, Mira Marto, and just for you, Faith the Gray, I'm real. Anyway, have a great day, guys, and let me know if you want to hear you out there, too. A flight south to Florida. I got bumped to first class. Just after they served our meal, the pilot came on intercom and said, "Flight attendants, return to your seats now." I flew a ton, why I got bumped, and had never heard that before, but I knew what it meant. I was covered everything I could on my tray with my arms and hands. Just after the flight attendants had buckled up, we hit really rough turbulence and immediately dropped straight down. My salad bowl floated literally in front of my face for about 5 seconds, then BAM! It was like we landed on concrete, but everything was fine. Only injury was a woman who 2 rows in front of me who stupidly didn't have her seatbelt on. Flew really hard straight up into the overhead bins, had an ice pack on her head and neck to rest the flight. Oh, also had a go-round immediately after touching down, and those planes can move when the pilots want them to, like being shot out of a cannon. On approach to land in New Orleans, pilot announced he couldn't confirm the nose landing gear was down or locked in place. We put on seatbelts and put our head between our knees as instructed. Lots of crying and praying for a few minutes. We landed fine. Loud cheers didn't get us to use the slides. Sliding off a runway in NOLA lands you in a swamp if done properly. Gators would have ate good that afternoon. Many years ago, I was working on an offshore drilling rig in Venezuela, and we were flying from Caracas on an old DC-3 to a small airfield in the jungle to catch a helicopter to the rig. The pilot started landing too late, ran out of runway, and had to pull up at the last second. We were so low that the wheels touched the treetops on the way up. We eventually landed safely, but that had most of us pretty scared. When our 4-week rotation was done and we had to fly back on the same plane, it was a little nerve-wracking. Engine made funny noises during pushback. I hoped if anything was wrong, they would stop. Plane went back to the jet bridge. Flight delayed a few hours while the starboard engine was opened up and worked on. People were complaining, but I was glad the noises happened on the ground and not in the air. I was scared they would continue takeoff procedures, though part of me was like, don't worry, they know what they're doing. Engine on a fully loaded 744 going bang at not far off 100 knots on the runway on takeoff. Not V1, but not exactly slow either. The plane lurched violently to one side, then heavily corrected by the rudder, so it lurched back the other way. Then a very hard emergency stop. The brakes on those things are more powerful than I would have ever guessed, and not something I would want to repeat. Absolutely being terrifying. Spoke with the captain and first officer afterwards, which is how I know the speed, and they were cool as cucumbers. Very glad to have competent crew that day. At that time, I routinely flew maybe 10 flights a week for business, and I was really so very spooked for weeks after that. I had to do some flying lessons to get me to be comfortable in any sort of plane again. I was on a puddle jumper prop plane going from Fort Lauderdale to Marsh Harbor in the Bahamas when I noticed that the pilot's head drooped. At first I thought maybe there was a medical emergency, but then he started snoring. I elbowed the guy next to me and said, "I think our pilot's sleeping." My fellow passenger said, "Yeah, he always falls asleep on the way over." I once had to sit on a Northwest Airlines flight out of Minneapolis for 9 hours. We had taxied out onto the runway, but a blizzard hit and the temperature dropped way below freezing. Because we had pulled away from the gate, we had to wait to be de-iced for 9 hours. A 2-year-old and a York ran up and down the aisle of the plane because we were on the ground. No food, drinks, or snacks could be served. Then the toilets became clogged. We finally took off and made our final destination. When we got off the plane, a Northwest Airlines flight attendant offered each passenger 1 free drink ticket that could be used on their next flight. I swear I almost had a nervous breakdown. Had a flight take a rapid dive down to 10,000 feet due to what I'm guessing was a pressurization issue. We flew at that low flight level the rest of the way, over an hour, Flight was absolutely freezing and they never said a word about it. Runner-up was taking off just as the airport was closing due to thunderstorms. Most turbulent flight of my life. Bins popping open, phones flying out of people's hands, people crying. Let me tell you about my most upsetting plane experience. This was a few years ago, flying short haul to our annual vacation in the Mediterranean. It was an early flight, and it must have been about 25 years ago because tiny cooked breakfasts were being served to everyone on board. The four of us, my wife, 2 kids, and I, sat in the same row. My youngest wasn't feeling great, so when she was offered her breakfast by the flight attendant, she declined. Before I could react, the cabin attendants had moved on. That was that. Instead of accepting the breakfast and then passing it to me, their father, they just waved it away. After a quarter of a century, I'm still not over it. Heading back to Iraq from Qatar on a C-130. Everyone was asleep and suddenly I awoke feeling weightless. The pilot came over the intercom and asked, "Does anyone know how far this plane can fly with half its engines out?" "I'll get you to the scene of the crash." After the pilot was done laughing, he told us they lost half the engines, and we were turning around to head back to Qatar. We landed safely 45 minutes later. Flying from Denver to Seattle due to really rough turbulence, the plane drops approximately 5,000 feet in elevation. It's a phenomenon. Some overhead bins open up, people gasp. At the moment the plane stabilizes, this repeated kind of chirping sound starts going off. A couple stewardesses go rushing around the cabin, scrambling to find the source of this alarm. Turns out it was some 8 or 9-year-old kid that just decided to blow a whistle when the plane evened out. Had nothing to do with the drop. It was the chirping, though, which everyone assumed was some kind of alarm that was the scariest part. My heart was in my throat. Also, had another situation where I was flying from Newark, New Jersey to Frankfurt, Germany. Out of the blue, technically, figuratively, and literally, I guess, the plane starts a super quick descent as we're flying over England. Pilot announces that he's making an emergency landing. The descent was super aggressive and steep, but the plane came in and landed smoothly and safely at Heathrow without issue. It was scary and everyone was understandably freaked. Pilot comes on and says thanks for our patience and cooperation. Turns out a passenger was having a medical emergency. Would have been nice if the pilot had mentioned that in the first announcement. I had to go around at San Francisco on a Boeing 787 last year. I know it's a normal procedure, but the way it felt as a passenger, I got spooked. We were lined for landing maybe 50 feet of the runway, when all of a sudden engines revved up to the max, loud, and the plane nose pointed up, steep enough for one of the flight attendants to tumble down the aisle. People got scared and I remember getting pressed into my seat. It was all good after all, oddly enough. Pilots did not comment on it at all on the intercom. Later I found out they were probably lined to land on the runway that was at the time closed to renovations and had construction equipment and workers on it. I was on a Ryanair flight, pretty young, so my memory of the details aren't great, 2005-ish. So the flight was pretty quiet, a little bit of turbulence because it was stormy, but apart from that, we were just cruising, watching lightning in the distance. Everything I've read says this is impossible, and I know I'm just a random person online, but I swear we got struck by lightning. It was like a flashbang went off inside the cabin. The whole plane jolted like it hit turbulence, and then there was just silence and darkness, like so quiet. I could swear I heard the wind outside. I don't know how trustworthy that part of my memory is. It felt like we lost some altitude in the glide, though. It stayed like that for probably a few seconds, but it felt like forever. Long enough to start panicking, cause everyone in the cabin started making noise. Then the power came back on, the engine spun back up, and the flight went on like normal. I think the pilots announced that they shut everything off to protect the plane from electrical discharge, but I don't remember exactly what they said. I was kind of more focused on how great it was to hear the engine drone again. Just about shit myself, though. I flew out of Vegas not long after ago, just as a storm was rolling in. We sat on the tarmac for 45 minutes between waiting for takeoff and then finally changing lanes to take off in a different direction. When we finally took off during our climb, we hit crazy turbulence. It was nonstop up and downs for, and I'm not exaggerating, 4 to 5 minutes straight. Big turbulence, like 5-foot drops every 20 seconds. You could feel the whole plane just drop and bank hard left and drop hard and bank right again and again. After the first 2 minutes of this, it didn't feel like we were pointing up anymore either. The worst part of it was every drop and big back that happened, it got worse and more violent, like they were legitimately losing control of the plane. The whole cabin was just eerily quiet. Everyone had both hands on the handrests above them, and with every drop, people were gasping louder and louder. Ice flown a number of times, and known turbulence is usually nothing, but it was actually terrifying, just because of how long it lasted and how it felt like it kept getting worse. It didn't help at all knowing we were flying toward mountains. I learned after I landed that we were in the last plane out that day. They canceled all other flights out, including the ones waiting to take off. It was pretty not cash money. Flight out of DC National at the time, we were accelerating down the runway when all of a sudden the plane swerved off to the left onto the taxiway. I was sitting in a window seat on the right side of the plane. When we turned, I saw that another plane had landed on our runway and was headed straight to our plane. The pilot turned the plane around and said, "Sorry for that episode, was brought to you by the FAA, who believes it's a good idea to have planes take off and land on the same runway at the same time. We're going back to the end of the runway and take off." And he did. He was going so fast to get back to the end of the runway that the tires made a loud screeching sound as he turned back onto the runway and took off. On an RJ from Denver to Casper, first they put too much gas on, so we had to burn some off to make weight. No big deal. Happens, I guess. So we sit there for quite a while, and Captain, okay, we've burned enough fuel, but now we're overheating the brakes. So we sit long and finally on our way. Now the fun part. I'm sitting behind a pilot, dead heading home, and about halfway through the flight, he rings his call button. FA comes back and he leans in and says, "Tell the captain the leading edges are icing over." She scurries up to the front and then comes back and says, "You're not." He knows. So we descend down pretty fast and land at some random airport along the way. The pilot, hitching a ride, kept trying to shine his flashlight out the window to keep an eye on it the entire way down. Very unnerving. Other than that, just turbulence experiences. Nothing scary, honestly. Just not fun. Flying into Maui on a trip with my wife and parents, when we were scheduled to land, we began to descend, but then abruptly began to ascend again. We flew in circles around the airport for 40 minutes, and no one was sure why. My wife was extremely anxious, thinking there was something wrong, and I kept downplaying it. When we finally attempted to land again, we were tailed by a ton of emergency vehicles. It turns out that we were circling to burn fuel because there was something wrong, and if we crashed, it would be less likely that we burned up. Landing at Toronto Island Airport, Billy Bishop, in extreme fog. When we took off from Montreal, I was 100% certain that there would be no way the flight would land on the island. We circled for 45 minutes in the fog and clouds and heavy turbulence, attempted 2 landings, decreasing altitude and pulling up sharply. The fog cover was so close to the ground you couldn't see anything until the last minute. When we finally touched down, we landed hard and the brakes went on so hard that we all were thrown in our seats. Getting off the plane, people were looking at each other saying, "That was really bad, right?" That was 3 years ago. I travel a ton for work in the financial district, but I refuse to fly in or out of that airport regardless of how convenient it is. My dad and his partners used to travel to remote communities in northern Canada. Flights were so expensive, it was more cost-effective to buy a small plane and pay a pilot. As an engagement gift to my fiancée and I, my dad arranged for us to go out for dinner and then a night flight to see the Northern Lights. What my dad failed to mention was that the pilot was willing to do it because he was doing a test for some certification, and so he needed the flight time and to practice a specific maneuver. Attempted landing and then go back up and attempt again. This included communication with the tower. So there we were, almost landing, hearing the pilot say that his landing was aborted, then go back up, circle the airport, and try again. We did that 7 or 8 times before landing. The pilot looked at us. I had been crying, my fiancé was white and shaking, and apologized profusely when he realized we didn't know what was going on. Definitely the scariest, even though we were not actually in danger. Flight out of New Orleans. They were trying to beat the hurricane that was coming back in the 90s. Made it up in the air a little later than the flight attendants brought out the beverage cart. The airplane dropped what seemed like minutes. The flight attendant got smashed between the cart and the ceiling and broke her hip and shoulder. I was in the middle seat with my seatbelt on with 2 girlfriends on either side. They didn't have theirs on. I was able to grab one of the others, hit her head on the ceiling, and needed stitches. We landed in, I think, Tallahassee, put in a hotel for a bus ride to Fort Lauderdale. I was in Mexico visiting a mill and we traveled on the company jet. We were on our way back to Mexico City and the weather turned bad. We could see the pilot struggling before we even felt the turbulence, but once we did feel it, it was severe and it felt like we were being thrashed about. We had several sudden drops in elevation and could hear the pilot shouting. One of the guys traveling with us worked his way to the cockpit and then came back ashen-faced. He said the pilots were trying to find an airport for an emergency landing, but had been denied access. Apparently the president of the very large corporation we were traveling with had a beef with the president of Mexico over some policy, and there were only a few airports that would accept our plane. Suddenly we landed illegally and were ushered into a giant hangar where they quickly unloaded us and rushed us into waiting cars, and we basically sped off. That was wild. Still don't understand. The gentleman that came back to his seat ashen-faced said the pilots had seemed very concerned and the issue was wind shear. I'm so thankful he kept the information to himself, so thankful to have landed safely.